The Xylons, A Tale of Transformation and Uprising. Once upon a time, in a remote corner of the universe, there lived a species of beings called the Xylons. They were a mysterious species, with skin as dark as the void of space and eyes that shone like stars. No one knew where they came from, or what their purpose was, but one thing was for sure: they were not friendly. One day, a small team of astronauts were on a mission to explore a distant planet. As they entered the atmosphere of the planet, their ship suddenly malfunctioned and crashed to the surface. The astronauts were the only survivors, and they found themselves stranded on the hostile planet. As they searched for help, they stumbled upon a strange, glowing structure in the middle of a barren wasteland. They cautiously approached it, wondering if it was some kind of alien artifact. But as they got closer, they realized that it was not a structure, but a massive spaceship. Little did they know, this was the spaceship of the Xylons, and they were about to come face to face with the most terrifying creatures in the universe. Stay tuned for part 2, where the astronauts will encounter the Xylons and their fate will be revealed. The astronauts cautiously approached the spaceship, their hearts racing with fear and excitement. They had never seen anything like it before, and they were eager to explore the alien technology and learn more about the Xylons. As they entered the ship, they were met with a strange, otherworldly glow. The walls were made of some kind of shimmering metal, and the air was filled with a strange, pulsating hum. They felt like they had stepped into a whole new world. Suddenly, they heard a loud, clanging noise coming from the shadows. They turned to see a group of Xylons emerging from the darkness. The creatures stood tall and menacing, their skin as black as the void of space and their eyes shining like stars. The astronauts were paralyzed with fear, but before they could run, the Xylons spoke in a strange, guttural language. It was unlike anything the astronauts had ever heard before, and it filled them with a sense of dread. Despite their fear, the astronauts tried to communicate with the Xylons, but their efforts were in vain. The Xylons seemed to have no interest in communicating with them, and instead, they began to circle the astronauts, closing in on them from all sides. The astronauts knew they were in grave danger, and they prepared for the worst. But what happened next would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The Xylons closed in on the astronauts, their eyes shining with a cold, malicious light. The astronauts were backed up against a wall, with no escape in sight. Suddenly, the Xylons let out a series of high-pitched screeches, and the astronauts felt their bodies being lifted into the air by some unseen force. The Xylons began to inspect the astronauts, examining them with their glowing eyes. The astronauts could feel the Xylons probing thoughts inside their minds, and they realized that the Xylons were reading their thoughts and emotions. As the Xylons continued their examination, the astronauts' fear and desperation grew stronger. Suddenly, the Xylons let out a series of guttural growls, and the astronauts felt their bodies being drained of all their energy. The last thing the astronauts remembered before blacking out was the Xylons' cold, triumphant laughter. When they awoke, they found themselves lying on the ground outside the spaceship. They were weak and disoriented, but they were alive. They stumbled to their feet and tried to make their way back to their crashed spaceship, but they soon realized that something was wrong. They had changed. They were no longer human. The astronauts soon realized that they had been transformed by the Xylons. Their skin was now a dark, inky black, just like the Xylons, and their eyes glowed with the same cold, alien light. They had been transformed into Xylons themselves, but they retained their human thoughts and memories. As they struggled to come to terms with their new reality, they felt a strange pull towards the Xylon spaceship. They had no choice but to follow it, as if they were being controlled by an unseen force. When they reached the ship, the Xylons welcomed them with open arms. They were no longer seen as outsiders, but as one of their own. The Xylons revealed to the astronauts their true purpose: to explore the universe and gather knowledge from other species. They did this by transforming their subjects into Xylons, just like the astronauts, so that they could learn from their thoughts and memories. The astronauts were horrified. They had been transformed into alien creatures, forced to gather knowledge for the Xylons. But they soon realized that they were not alone. There were others like them, beings from all over the universe who had been transformed and forced to serve the Xylons. The astronauts were trapped, forced to spend the rest of their existence serving the Xylons and gathering knowledge for them. They had become creatures of the void, lost in the endless darkness of spaces. Years passed, and the astronauts continued to serve the Xylons, exploring the universe and gathering knowledge. But as they traveled from planet to planet, they realized that they were not the only ones being oppressed by the Xylons. They encountered countless other beings who had been transformed and forced to serve the Xylons, just like they had been. The astronauts felt a growing sense of anger and resentment towards the Xylons. They had been stripped of their freedom and their humanity, and they were determined to fight back. They began to secretly gather allies from among the other transformed beings, and they developed a plan to overthrow the Xylons and reclaim their freedom. Finally, the day of the uprising arrived. The astronauts and their allies launched a full-scale attack on the Xylon spaceship, determined to take back control of their lives. The battle was long and brutal, but in the end, the astronauts and their allies emerged victorious. They had defeated the Xylons and taken control of their spaceship, but as they looked out into the endless darkness of space, they realized that their victory was a hollow one. They were no longer human, and they would never be able to return to their old lives. They were creatures of the void, lost in the endless blackness of the universe, but they were free. And in that freedom, they found solace. They would continue to explore the universe, to gather knowledge and discover new worlds. And they would do so as their own masters, no longer bound by the will of the Xylons. They were creatures of the void, but they were also the masters of their own fate.